Hi, my name is Julian Carrington, and I work with Hot Docs, where my role includes programming for the Four Viola series. Before we jump into our John Ware Reclaimed Q&A with filmmaker Cheryl Foggo, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Hot Docs is a settler-run organization and that we're based on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat, as well as the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. This land is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, a treaty that initially bound the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee to share the territory and to protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and settler newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work in this place. This is a place that we continue to share with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Wherever you're joining us from, I encourage you to reflect on your relationship to that land and also to consider taking action in support of First Nations communities, whether by contributing funds to Indigenous land defenders, supporting a local friendship center, or offering some other form of support that is meaningful to you. And with that, I am now delighted to introduce Cheryl, who, in addition to directing John Ware Reclaimed, is an award-winning playwright, author, and screenwriter. She has devoted much of her career to telling stories focused on the lives of Western Canadians of African descent. Cheryl, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Very nice to be here, Julian.
I have to say, I'm so pleased we were able to include John Ware Reclaimed in the Blacklight series, in part because between your film and Sylvia Hamilton's film, Black Mother, Black Daughter, we have stories of two Black Canadian communities on both sides of the country that predate many people's understandings of Black settlement in Canada. And while I think there's perhaps some familiarity with the African Nova Scotian community and the history of Africville and sites like that, representations of Black settlement in Western Canada have been, at least in my experience, even rarer. So I suppose just thank you for your work in illuminating that community.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I think in general, our Black history in Canada is not well known, very much so in Western Canada, but even in places like Nova Scotia, where most Canadians have a shallow understanding, there's just so much more work to be done. So I love the work that Sylvia does, and it's an honor to be there alongside her work.
Well, again, we're so glad we could bring you both together, so to speak. In terms of this conversation, I wanted to begin by asking you about some of the unique challenges of presenting Black history in the Canadian context. It occurs to me that exploring Black history in Canada isn't just a case of excavating narratives that haven't previously been widely presented. It's also about perhaps countering or overcoming narratives that Canadians want to believe about our history, but that perhaps aren't fully justified. So in your film, you have a conversation with Bertrand Bickersteth, and it's about that. And I think about, for instance, that iconic Heritage Minute about the Underground Railroad, which feeds into the narrative that Canada was a place of refuge for people fleeing enslavement and racism. And that, has helped to feed our national mythology about tolerance and sort of seamless integration. But I wonder whether in celebrating that story, there isn't also a danger that we leave less celebratory aspects of the Black Canadian experience unsaid. Have you found that you've had to sort of displace some of that mythology for your readers and your audiences in your work?
Absolutely. And you're very correct that it is a challenge. I refer to that mythology that we have about ourselves as Canadians as relates to racism and systemic racism and its presence from the very beginning and the impact on all racialized communities. I refer to that as the bedtime story we tell ourselves or have been told about ourselves as Canadians. And it is incredibly painful for many Canadians to have that story disrupted, and that disruption for some people results in denial. I've been accused of lying. Yeah, it is really challenging, and it's really unfortunate that we have not been given a more complete story. So, you mentioned the iconic Heritage Minute about the Underground Railroad. That story is true. And we're very poor at saying both and. Yes, that story is true. And yes, people who came up on the Underground Railroad were subjected to segregated schools and inability to make a living and all kinds of brutality. We're just not good at talking about the both and.
Yeah, very much so. It was striking to me watching the film that in some ways your family's presence in this country is arguably partly a product of that national mythology or that bedtime story, in that your ancestors were part of the Black migration of 1910 and were drawn north partly in the hope that they would find greater tolerance. And then, we see that montage of newspaper headlines that shows that was not, in fact, the case.
Yeah, it was devastating for people. I did a presentation earlier this month with my daughter, who you met in the film, who is a singer-songwriter, and it's about spirituals and about how much of the information that my ancestors had about Canada came through that legacy of songs, that body of music, which referred to, the North, and in some cases specifically to Canada. And that's what they thought they were coming into. They thought they were coming into that promised land, that place of refuge and freedom that their own ancestors and themselves within their communities had been singing about for, more than a century. So it is, my family's presence in this part of the world is very much a part of that mythology. And it is also very much a both and story. That people stayed, and some people thrived eventually, very much as a part of communities, as a part of other Black people who supported them, Indigenous people who helped them to survive. And yes, they did find some wonderful neighbors among their European communities that were alongside them. However, they also experienced being segregated or refused admission to schools and all kinds of places, and problems with policing, and just in general, even just right at the border, the reception that they received from day one was not what they were expecting.
Before we jump into some further specific questions about the film, I did want to linger on this question about telling Black Canadian history for a moment, because I'm also curious, in your experience, what does our proximity to the United States add to this conversation in terms of, I think for many Canadian cultural producers, obviously there's a geographic, but also cultural proximity to the USA that can mean that there are dynamics to navigate in telling Canadian stories. And I think in the case of the US, with such a powerful set of narratives around African American history, are there unique challenges that come with convincing gatekeepers of the value of specifically Black Canadian stories, of sort of communicating some of the differences and some of the nuances that might exist between those two sets of history?
Oh, yes, very much so. I think in part it's because as Canadians, we tend to think of our own history as boring. That relates in part to the whitewashing of our history. We just tend to think it's just been just kind of a bland, peaceful situation where nothing ever happened. And that is very far from the truth. So there's the double challenge of overcoming people's lack of awareness. People don't know about these communities and they have a real disconnect. When you talk about the gatekeepers in terms of, well, is this true? And would anybody care? I remember Selwyn Jacob. I don't know if you must know Selwyn's work. He's a wonderful filmmaker. And I remember him saying the first time he proposed making a film about Amber Valley, somebody said to him, who cares about a bunch of Black farmers in Alberta? And as it turns out, a lot of people care. We do, for one thing. But I think there is a tendency to squash this narrative because it simply doesn't fit in with what people believe happened, what they think Canadians in general will be interested in hearing about. So there are many, many challenges embedded in that. And it does relate to standing alongside that powerful narrative to the south of us. It's also very connected to that.
Undoubtedly. Yeah.
I often say that our people were borderless people in that 49th parallel border was just a number. There was so much back and forth. There was so much connection. There was so much communication. Same with the border between Alberta and Saskatchewan. The folks who came up and created those 5 small communities didn't think of themselves as, well, I'm a Saskatchewanite or I'm an Albertan. They were just people seeking peace and safety, which is a story of African people all over the world.
Typically with filmmaker Q&As, I might begin with a question about what drew the filmmaker to the story or the subject matter. But I think the film itself speaks to that pretty explicitly. We see you talk about your first learnings of John Ware. You talk about the Glenbow Museum and the idea that you were kind of incredulous that you hadn't previously encountered him in school or in sort of folklore. And there was also a recognition that his story was in dialogue with your own family history. So we saw that, but I'm curious if you can expand on how you progress from that moment to John Ware Reimagined, the play, and then on to the film version, John Ware Reclaimed.
Yeah, Tundi Dewadu, who was the artistic director of Africa Day, approached me in 2011, I think it was, and said, next year is the anniversary of the Stampede, and we want to make sure John Ware isn't forgotten. Now, it's always important for me to say John Ware died 7 years before the first Stampede, but he was really integral to the community that created it and that the culture, that sort of Western cowboy culture that led to the creation of Stampede. So I always want to credit Tundi for reminding me that when our city and our provinces and our nation celebrates milestones, it's actually on us to make sure that the Black history that is connected to those milestones is recognized and not forgotten. So I had been building a file on John Ware for a long time. I just had never really done anything with it. And I thought, yeah, this is a good time. So I just made a little Black History Month presentation that was, me at a podium with some slides, and my daughter wrote a couple of songs. I hired a couple of actors, wrote 2 or 3 scenes, and the play developed out of that because the audience connection to the story was just so powerful. John Ware is just such a powerful figure in every way. He's attractive. He just is. And so the play developed out of that presentation. And after doing the play, which is very much a fictionalized experience, it's, me letting myself live in a time and space with John Ware, where he comes forward into my time and my childhood, and I go backward into he and Mildred and their children's time. That's a fiction. And yet I realized that a lot of people walked away from the play thinking they had witnessed a scene that happened in John and Mildred Ware's cabin that was real and was based on, that somehow I was a fly on the wall and heard them saying those things to each other. And, I mean, theater is powerful, and people will sometimes think that, that a story is more real than what it was. So I felt I wanted to make another document of some kind that was more documentary, that was more factual and based on what I am able to know at this time. So that's kind of the genesis of the film, was going through all those steps.
It was striking to learn at the end of the film that despite having had several children, John and Mildred aren't survived by any further living ancestors. Do you think that in any way has informed your relationship to their story? Almost as though in the absence of a family lineage, you've kind of become a sort of a custodian of their legacy. Is that at all how you think about this work?
I do. And I think that's both for good and for ill, because I do feel a very strong bond to that family, and I do feel a responsibility toward that story. At the same time, I am not able to really separate my love for John Ware from the telling of the story. I guess, in a way that a family member might have an issue with, but that is a challenge for a storyteller too, especially a documentarian. And I wanted to be upfront about that in the film.
Well, that actually very much anticipates my next question, which is about the film's form and style and your own presence in it. You really don't give us the traditional solitary talking head in the frame. Everyone that you feature is presented in conversation with you, and the conversations are very much framed as part of your journey. I think your response just now began to speak to this, but I'd love to hear more about why you felt that was the way you needed to tell the story.
It's a great question. Part of the reason is the challenges of getting the story made at all, because many people don't think history is important, or it's not a part of a certain organization's storytelling toolbox. Both in the writing of the play and in the making of the film, I had to be very explicit about, why does this matter? Why does it matter? It's because it matters to the life of a human being that is in the present. And it matters to our lives in this part of the world in the future, because of everything that was built upon that past. So that was a very reluctant choice I made in the writing of the play. Originally, I did not want to put myself into it, but I couldn't get traction with making it happen, because so many people just said that nobody wants to see a historical play. So that was part of it. And then as I went through that process, I realized that that's a legitimate choice, and it's a choice that is so resonant for Black artists, because we are so present with our ancestors. What happened to them is still in our blood very much. It's not, our past is not something we can walk away from. And it is really connected to our future and our younger generations. So I feel it is, I do feel ultimately it was the right choice to make, but it was a reluctant choice in the beginning.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So the film premiered in late 2020, which was obviously a particularly timely moment in terms of conversations about race and representation in Canadian culture and media. But it obviously would have been in development and production long before the 2020 moment of reckoning. I'm wondering what it's been like to navigate with this story sort of over this period of time, have you observed a shift in discourse between when you were making the film at the outset and the time of its release? And if so, how would you characterize that shift?
Yes, I have noticed a shift in the discourse. So whenever our stories become particularly relevant because other people are able to see the reality of our lives, there is interest in our stories, and they sort of suddenly seem relevant. Um, there's also then an inevitable pushback. So the shift in the discourse has been both positive in that there's this interest and there's understanding in some quarters. It has also there has also been that pushback, which I knew would happen, but it is not just in relationship directly to this film. It is also in relationship to everything that's going on around us, and some people's reluctance to accept our reality. The insistence some people always have of thinking that every instance of public racism is a one-off, that it's an anomaly. So the discourse shift has been has led to, you know, me being quite busy in terms of conversation, because there are lots of people who want to hold these conversations now, and it also has led to, you know, a little bit more, I don't know, danger is maybe too strong a word to use, but you know what I'm talking about.
I do
Yeah.
actually. Again, you're anticipating my next question here, which I'm also thinking is perhaps where we can wind the conversation down, as you know, I'm again thankful for the time that you've given us so far. But I did want to ask you, sort of looking forward, you know, we've seen these milestones, like for instance, The Porter premiering this month on CBC, or the Black on the Prairies project, also at the CBC, that I know you are on the advisory board of, which is great, which is long overdue. But as you know, you were alluding to, I think in your previous answer, we're also hearing about the supposed divisiveness that's created when we teach histories that may involve, you know, racism and oppression. And perhaps that conversation isn't quite as lively in Canada as it is in the US yet. But, you know, again, I feel like the cultural barrier between us is so thin and permeable that it seems like, you know, there's a good chance that that conversation may grow here as well. How do you feel about the future, if this isn't too grand a question, of Black stories and storytelling in Canada, given that sort of tension that you know, or that potential for backlash that you know?
Yeah, I feel very good about the future, because what we have learned is that we can support each other in the telling of our stories. And I know that that will never go away, no matter what the wider conversation is. We will still find ways to tell our stories. And it simply is true that there are more platforms available. So as that conversation goes on, and as that I don't know, what's the word, the ridiculous notion that us telling our stories creates division, is that is a conversation that, for in many ways, is really out of our hands. And we cannot let that conversation be a distraction to us and the very powerful tool of telling our stories from our perspectives, telling our stories from the inside, which is really what I wanted to do with the film. So I feel I look around and I see an explosion of young Black filmmakers, playwrights, visual artists, novelists, young adult novelists, and I feel so excited about the future of Black storytelling in Canada. And, I would just repeat that nobody is going to take that away.
Mm. Well, I think that's a wonderful place to conclude the conversation. Cheryl, thank you so much for the Q&A and for the film. And to those of you who've tuned into the Blacklight series, thank you for watching.
Thank you. A real pleasure to chat with you, Julian.